Well, good evening and welcome to another edition of Anomalies, the show about shadows, about mysteries, about things seen out of the corner of one's eye, a show about the paranormal. I'm one of your hosts, Dan Hall of the Olympia Paranormal Research Group, and I'm joined by my co-host and friend, Dave Jinks. Dave, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great, Dan. Thank you. How about you?
Good. Tonight's topic is somewhat triggered for me by a video that I was watching the other day on the internet. And this video was of a guy that you were very familiar with, Colin Andrew. And Colin Andrew was essentially, this video was about a 20-minute kind of summary of his work, which his work is in the fascinating world of crop circles. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And I know that you've done quite a bit of research in this area. So, what was your first introduction to this idea of crop circles? When did you first hear about that? And when did you first become interested in it? You remember that?
Probably in the early 90s, probably 93, I would say. Listening to a radio show, actually, Laura Lee. I don't know if you ever heard Laura Lee. She was in the Seattle area, and she would have a Saturday night show with various, controversial science topics is what I call them. And she would have really intriguing discussions, and, she had people who researched the crop circle phenomenon. I think that's where I first heard about these things, and like everybody else, when I saw the pictures of them, it kind of struck me like, wow, that's if that's people doing it, it's pretty good art, and if it's not people, then that makes it even more interesting.
Yeah, in this video, Colin Andrew talks about the first time he ever encountered a crop circle, which I believe was in the 1980s. And he evidently was some kind of a official for the British government. He may be an engineer, some kind of scientist by trade. He was on his way to some kind of meeting somewhere, and the road happened to kind of go up in elevation. He happened to look over into this farmer's field, and he sees this weird design. And he goes, what the heck is this? Mm-hmm. And so he's been studying this phenomena for, well, I guess getting on maybe 30 years now, and probably knows more about it than he did on that first day that he saw the crop circle on his way to a meeting. But certainly the answers to this enigma aren't probably any more forthcoming than they were 20, 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And they're fascinating because, they leave evidence that you can see. They're stunning to look at, I suppose, compared to other topics that we may discuss here, other possibly related topics, maybe UFOs, maybe, Bigfoot. Some of those other, not saying those are related necessarily to crop circles, but those areas of research, they don't leave such big, obvious, persistent imagery and evidence. And that, of course, is one of the best things about the crop circle phenomenon, in that you have something to study. And you can go into the fields and you can gather samples, you can take pictures, you can do measurements of electromagnetic radiation, you can measure the effects on people, and with the internet now you can access it and always go back to really the beginning of this phenomenon. Sort of coincided with the rise of the internet too.
Well, and that's what's kind of interesting, got me thinking about this Colin Andrew video, because I have, and I think I've shared with you, I have a VHS tape called Crop Circles Quest for Truth. And I think Colin Andrew appears in that, but there are other people in there. But as I recall in that video, we're talking about the beginnings of this. I just mentioned, kind of our knowledge of this kind of comes around with the invention of the internet and what Colin Andrews does. But in this video tape, Quest for Truth, they actually talk about something like a crop circle showing up in cereal crops almost back in the Middle Ages. And the explanation, which isn't too far-fetched given what probably was the explanation for a lot of things in the Middle Ages, is that they were the result of some kind of satanic activity. As a matter of fact, I believe that VHS tape specifically refers to the term mowing devil, and that so some of this stuff has probably been out there a lot longer than what we would contemporarily think it has, but certainly the interest in it and maybe just the investigation of it has gotten more intense in the last 20, 30 years type of thing.
Yeah, as we talked about in our first podcast, I did write about this in my book, The Monkey and the Tetrahedron, and I documented some of the early reports, and they're, I think what you're talking about, the mowing devil, and I don't know if that meant the same thing as it does now, mowing as in cut. I don't know if the grain was cut, but typically in the crop circle phenomenon we witness now, it's not cut, it's just laid
bent
gently
over,
down.
right.
And I believe that might have been, the farthest back that I have for a crop circle report is 1678.
Wow.
I'm thinking maybe that was the mowing devil.
Right.
But these things, there were at least 100 prior to 1980. And people typically think of this phenomenon as having started up in the basically the late 80s, and then it really sort of took off in the early 90s. But these things have been around for possibly hundreds of years.
Well, I think your point about our interest in them being maybe fed by contemporary media is important because it just seems like even though things have been around for a long time, the interest that one has in something kind of changes over a period of time. For instance, one of the things that came out in this report that Colin Andrews was giving in this little YouTube interview was he said that initially he felt that, and it seemed like a lot of the media reports confined this phenomena to southeastern England, which is kind of where he was living at the time, and specifically seemed to confine it to the area where Stonehenge was at. But then all of a sudden, then you start hearing about examples of crop circles occurring in other countries. And initially, I think he saw the Colin Andrews videotape or the VHS tape said that the first crop circle he saw appeared in some kind of cereal crop. I don't know if that was wheat, barley, oats, or whatever. But then now it seems like there are designs appearing in other kinds of vegetation beside that. And hopefully we can talk about this, you had an experience where you saw some kind of formation in sand. Do I remember that correctly? So this sounds like this is just totally evolving into a lot of different types of environments where different kinds of formations are made, and the formations tend to increase in complexity, go from very simple formations to highly complex formations that might even have some kind of mathematical significance to them. So do you see that? I wonder if this is like an evolution of the phenomena, or it's just an evolution of our knowledge of the phenomena.
Well, it's tough to tell which one it is. I know that, and this is from a book by Elto, I believe his name is Hasselhoff. He's a PhD. I don't know if he's Dutch. It's been a while since I've read his book. He wrote a book, The Deepening Complexity of Crop Circles, in 2001. And like I said, he's a PhD, and he's documented a lot of these basic questions that you're asking, like such as how far back do they go? Is this a new phenomenon? He reported that as many as 10,000 crop circles have been known since 1976. So we know there have been as many as 10,000 in the last roughly, say, 30 to 35 years. So they've been going on. As you mentioned, they've appeared in virtually every medium. They've been documented tobacco, oilseed, rapeseed, wheat, barley, oats, flowers, most other agricultural crops, ice, snow, even trees, cornfield. Did I mention that? And of course sand, which is, personally, it's the interesting one to me because I had an experience with a sand circle too, which we could talk about. But they've also appeared in over 70 crop-growing countries. I know that a lot of them have occurred in England, and I don't know whether that enforces the theory that they're man-made or genuine in some energetic, non-man-made, phenomenon. It's been one of the big questions: is why are they concentrated in that area? Is there something special about that area, or is it just that's where people started paying attention and all the hoaxers descended upon England? And so I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know that they've appeared in over 70 crop-growing countries. The last count, only mainland China and South Africa had not reported the phenomenon.
That's interesting. The interesting thing that you just mentioned was about the proximity of these initial reports being in England. And, of course, that's some of the first reports. But one of the kind of side stories of those first reports included two gentlemen by the name, and I don't remember what their last names were, but first names were Doug and Dave. And the significance of these two guys was the media reported, and they probably revealed this to the media at some point in time, that they were in fact responsible for a lot of the early crop circles. And then you get into this notion of, well, if somebody claims something is a hoax, then everything that follows after that must also be a hoax, which isn't good logic. But so Colin Andrews was saying in this little piece that I was talking about earlier that he thinks that maybe 75% of the crop circles that he has investigated or have been reported are probably hoaxed crop circles. And he showed some examples of that where somebody had essentially made faces. I think there was even a face that kind of looked like President Obama in one medium. Somebody put a car or a bus as a figure in some kind of crop. But still that leaves 25%. So some of those seem to be obvious hoaxes just by the nature of the design. But some of the other designs would seem more kind of ethereal or mathematical. There's still a 25% out there that could be non-man-made. Of course, then the question becomes who makes those and what are their significances and those kind of things.
Well, to me, that's just a big guess, 75%. I don't know how he could specifically come to that number. And like you said, he's been in it for 30 years, so maybe he's probably got a better guesstimate than anybody else would have. Now, of course, you contrast that with the skeptics who say that 100% of them are hoaxes. That, to me, seems much less believable than Colin Andrews' estimate of 75%. But I guess it doesn't really matter, because if there's one that's genuine, that's all you need to have a new phenomenon that's well worth investigating. And the fact remains that 99+% of all formations are never shown to have been hoaxed mechanically, specifically by stepping on them with Doug and Dave. They
had some kind of a board, and they
had a board and ropes,
down on,
and they stomped on the board, and they rotated they put a stake in the middle and tied a rope to it, and then they went around in a circle. And I think it was Bauer and Chorley, I believe, are their last names. Doug Bauer, Dave Chorley, or the other way around. I don't remember. I think at least one of them has passed on.
I think they've got
a
great crop circle in the sky.
And I have an announcement to make on this podcast, a world exclusive just for you, Dan. I was the one who made all of them after Doug and Dave retired.
Well, Dave, I've almost suspected that it might have been you. Well, that is an earth-shaking announcement to make.
So we see how easy it is to claim something.
True. That's true.
Now demonstrating how is much more difficult. And yes, Doug and Dave, they did for a couple of high-profile documentaries. They showed Doug and Dave dutifully out in the fields stomping grain, and Dave Doug, I don't remember which one, had a little wire that he twisted from a coat hanger or something. He put it on the bill of his baseball cap, and he used it, he said, as a sight to align himself perfectly to create all this geometry. So their high-tech tools were a board, rope, and this bent coat hanger or something. And that's how they created all these precise geometrical forms, and plus they were 70, 60, 70.
They were fairly advanced in age.
Fairly elderly.
Well, now, so that brings to the interesting point about, and you were talking about crop circle theories, what are possible explanations, but what would be evidence of hoaxing? Would there be things that you could see in a formation that you would say, well, I can't prove that for sure, but that sounds or looks like something that humans would have constructed? Are there any identifying hoaxing factors that you've come across?
Well, the two big obvious ones would be video of someone actually doing it, or even a pre-announcement of that formation. And the fact is that we have very, very few of either of those. You'd think if people wanted to create this big media stir and make a name for themselves, that they would at least leak their intentions or tip a news agency off or something like that. I mean, the crop circle skeptics are very fond of using, the line that, people would do this, or aliens would do this, and they often skip over the obvious idea that people would do something to get a lot of publicity and make money off of it. And you really have a hard time finding people seeking publicity or having monetized this hoax into a living. You don't see evidence of humans benefiting from the phenomenon. And so there's always been this, on the side of mechanical flattening, which is, in other words, hoaxing, that camp, there's always been this idea that this is a bunch of rogue artists that operate in the dark of night, and they're never detected. And there's almost this mystique about these guys who apparently are in 70 countries across the world, creating 10,000 formations. They're very busy and secretive groups of people, and if there are groups, they're very coordinated too. They never get caught. There are a handful of cases where teams of crop circle makers, circle fakers, they call themselves, where they've been hired to do commercials. I think you mentioned, they'll do emblems, they'll do letters of a company, a logo, things like that. Someone did Obama's face, it sounds like. And they're very specifically hired to do those things. Usually those things are very straightforward. They don't involve intricate geometries. They don't involve any complicated mathematical theorems or anything like that. They're just block letters or, a simple logo. So again, there is that theory that people hoax them by flattening, like Doug and Dave did. And the only viable alternate theory is one that was outlined by Levengood. They call him Dr. W.C. Levengood. He's not actually a doctor, as I understand. He never finished...
PhD doctor kind of thing?
Yeah, he's a biophysicist. He never finished the very last requirement for his PhD, I believe. His thesis, something like that. He didn't finish it, so technically he can't claim...
He's not a
doctor, but he's been doing biophysics lab work for decades. And he was the one who, as far as I know, first came up with the plasma vortex theory, or I like to call it a plasma event hypothesis, because vortex implies like a tornado or something that would be conjure up a very specific image in most people's minds. And I think what he's describing is not something that we're familiar with in any case. It's just a plasma event. And basically what that is an electromagnetic event which creates rapid heating. It heats up the stalks of grain to the point where it essentially boils the water out, and then the stalks gently fall over. How it affects, snow, sand, other things, ice, I suspect it would melt. It would show signs of melting, obviously, in the snow and ice. But his hypothesis is a heating, basically, as opposed to stepping on the grain and flattening it. So stepping on a grain, how would you differentiate that from the heating? And the obvious thing is that you would have things that are broken. You'd have mud. You'd have footprints, obviously. You'd have people getting caught in the middle of a farmer's field, which is a crime. It's vandalism, it's destruction of personal property.
Trespass, all kinds of
Trespass. You'd have a lot of people with buckshot in their back ends. I mean, and so far there's none of that. There's not been a single person in all of these cases that has been caught in the act of creating one of these things, which to me is extraordinary when you think about how many of these things have just popped up, typically overnight. So that's if it's people hoaxing it, you should have had some cases of people being caught, in my mind. Now again, Colin Andrews, of course, having been in many fields, I'm sure he feels like he can tell the difference, and he probably can. And we know that there are hoaxes. I mean, certainly. We know that people can do these sorts of things, and they can actually come up with really decent and beautiful designs, too. We know that's the case. It has been demonstrated. But there's a whole host of probably 20 or 30 other criteria that you can look at to differentiate between the faked ones and the what we're presuming to be genuine circles too. And we can talk about more about those things too.
Seems like from the standpoint of someone who'd want to perpetrate a hoax, I'm thinking about kind of the general spectrum of paranormal types of phenomena that, for instance, the Olympia Paranormal Research Group looks into. That oftentimes if you have somebody seeking publicity about something, wanting to tell you about some kind of strange event, and I think you can't say that would be true in 100% of the cases, but sometimes that's a red flag because it's almost like they want some notoriety. It's the person who doesn't want to tell you or seems reticent to tell you about some kind of strange event that just that circumstance lends somewhat to the credibility that the person has.
Right, and the most well-known group of so-called circle fakers, I think they call themselves circle makers, the circle makers, I think they even have a website, circlemakers.org, I believe. Even they are upfront about their belief that some formations are genuine. So they kind of go into the fields at night hoping to catch a glimpse of the true phenomenon. So that kind of adds an interesting wrinkle to the whole thing. It's not just a bunch of artists out there to scam people. These guys, at least the hardcore ones, they really believe that their being in the field doing these things is somehow interacting with the genuine phenomenon, maybe spurring it on to do bigger, grander designs or something. So you have that interesting human dynamic in there too, as far as belief system. And when you have all these things that are so very complicated in one phenomenon, I like to go to the evidence, where you can actually go and pick samples up. You can take it into the lab. You can do objective analysis of grains. You can measure things. You can put them under X-ray diffraction, spectrographs. You can really dig down and see. And there are some really significant differences between crops that have been stepped on and crops that appear in these, again, what we're calling genuine formations.
Well, I think I've even seen some photographs of what you're talking about from Dr. Livengood. His research group is not, it's got the initials of three different people. Is it BLT research, something like that? But Livengood being one of them?
Yeah, W.C. Levengood.
Levengood, okay.
Yeah. He's the L, of course. B is John Burke, who passed away recently, I think within the last year or two. He was a physicist, I believe, and Nancy Talbot.
Talbot, right.
Talbot is basically the administrative person who could gather things. She wasn't specifically a degreed scientist, but she's really kind of the person that held together the team. Now, as far as I know, they're not together. Talbot is separate. She has BLT Research, which is bltresearch.com, which I recommend for anybody who's listening to this, because she has the most comprehensive database, basically, of all the things that Levengood did. They have hundreds of reports that they did in his lab over the last couple decades, and he actually has some peer-reviewed papers, too, explaining some pretty interesting stuff that they discovered in some of the formations that really, in my mind, conclusively showed that there is some energetic interaction going on. And to make a long story, a long paper short, what they discovered was that grain that they collected from a crop circle during a meteor shower, a known meteor shower, I forget which one it was, the Leonids or something, and what they discovered was that the meteoritic material which comes down, at that time of the meteor shower, they found that it had basically magnetized itself to the grain, or it had adhered itself to the grain such that the grain became magnetized. And the only way and then looking at under the microscope, they could see that the metal, the iron, had become molten, so it melted. Obviously, it had to be under high heat, and then it cooled and it stuck to the grain. And their conclusion was that there's no other mechanism where molten metal or metal from the iron from a meteoritic shower could become heated to the point where it would melt and stick to the grain. And so Dr. Levengood, or W.C. Levengood, hypothesized that it was the energy from whatever created the crop circle that melted it and stuck it to the grain. Now, of course, the skeptics were all over this, and they really focused in on this because, like I said, it was a peer-reviewed paper and published, and it made it through the peer review process, which is a very scary thing if you're very skeptical about a certain topic, and all of a sudden you have real scientists doing real research and critiquing each other's work and saying, that makes sense. That's okay to publish. That's a very scary thing if you're dead set against something ever achieving scientific status. And so their explanation was, I believe it was the Circle Makers, the group that I mentioned, that they had gone into the field and sprinkled iron shavings that they had shaved off of a piece of metal somewhere. And they sprinkled it around in the field, and that was their explanation for why this grain had molten iron in it and that had magnetized the crop. Obviously, to anyone who's thinking clearly, just throwing some metal shavings in a field is not going to cause the shavings to melt and adhere to the grain. But anyway, that's the kind of sort of experiment that really has convinced me that there's something going on that's very interesting and novel, and that we can look at this phenomenon in a scientific manner. And again, there are all sorts of other measurements with the length of nodes on the grain. Some of the nodes are blown out, big holes in them, the joints basically.
That's what I remember seeing from it might have been a Coast to Coast AM type of show. There were some pictures from BLT research, and it showed how the stalks of whatever kind of plant they were talking about, the nodes had been expanded. And once again, that seemed to be consistent with a kind of a elevation in temperature. More easily could explain that than a couple of septuagenarians with a plank, going through somebody's field. There's another factor here that is kind of interesting to me in terms of differentiating the hoaxes from these more genuine types of crop circle formations. So we talked a little bit about the structure of the type of plant and how it's changed. One of the things that you have indicated to me recently that's kind of new development, and I didn't necessarily hear this in Colin Andrews' piece, but there's some kind of foreign substance that has been created in some of these crop circles, some kind of a white powder. What's the story about that? What's the significance of that, and how might that be just another example of how something's probably not faked?
Well, that's a really bizarre one, and we were talking about it before the show, looking at BLT Research's site, and what was discovered in 2009 in Holland, I believe, where some formations had occurred, was some white powder that showed up in the center of several of the circles. It looks kind of like flour. They have some pictures here on the website. Again, I encourage anyone to go there if you're interested in this, because this is fascinating stuff.
And this is on the BLT website.
Right. And Nancy Talbot was the investigator who went there, and they collected this white powder, and they put it through all sorts of scientific analyses, X-ray, diffraction, looks like some infrared analysis. They really got down to look at the chemical structure of the powder, and it turns out that it was 99.99% pure hydromagnesite or hydromagnesite. I'm not sure how you say it, but hydrogen and magnesium comprised this this powder when they looked at the spectroscopy. And it turns out that this particular compound is extremely expensive to purchase. 0.2 of a pound, the going rate 2009, I don't know what it is now. It's not something you know off the top of your head typically, but it is used in scientific research, and to get it that pure, you need to refine it in a laboratory. And so 0.2 of a pound of this stuff is worth $717.
Oh my gosh.
And Talbot collected $7,000 worth of this powder from the centers of these various crop circle formations. So, you know, it's obvious that there's something amiss here. I suppose it really depends on where you're coming from, how you explain it, and no theory that I've heard is very adept at explaining this sort of observation. But it's real and it's there, and you have to figure out a way to explain it.
The only other theory I could think of that might fit would be that not only is Doug and Dave, if they were still around, septuagenarians, they're also philanthropic septuagenarians that have access to a lot of wealth in order to be able to carry out something like this.
Yeah, I suppose they really liked the way that this BLP group was keeping crop circles in the news, and they figured they'd give them a little,
compensation.
A little compensation to keep it going. And now I don't know if you can gather the stuff and sell it to a lab or something, but it's extremely expensive to get, and you don't just make it in your basement or something. Apparently, to make it that pure, you really need a high quality laboratory. So that's just kind of the latest weird phenomenon that's going on with crop circles. There have been plenty of other bizarre things. I know in the, I think it was 91, somewhere in the early 90s, that researchers decided to dig in a particular formation, and they found, as I recall, there were 3 circles and a more elaborate design around it, and they dug in the middle of these formations, and they retrieved big plates, and one of them was made out of, I think it was a gold, a silver, and a bronze or something like that. They retrieved a pile of gold, basically, that had the formation imprinted on it.
Wow.
Or raised. I think it was even a raised depiction of the overall formation on this gold plate that came out. Really bizarre report. I saw a picture of the gold. You know, unfortunately, that's one of those things you never hear what happened in the end.
Mm-hmm.
Did someone steal the gold? Was it pure gold? Did they sell it off? You know, it'd be tempting to dig that up to think that I'm going to take this pile of gold and melt it down, but you know, there have been several instances where just bizarre stuff like this powder, and it just keeps going and going. And
I'm almost reminded by the old tradition of alchemy, where people who felt that they had special abilities, chemical abilities, or maybe even magical abilities, could transform certain substances into gold, common substances into gold. Maybe there's a metaphor here for whomever or whatever is making the crop circles. It's a kind of an alchemy approach.
Yeah, it makes you think there's a message. Again, from a skeptical point of view, you would say, well, it's just someone trying to be more outrageous than the last guy. But you look at how many resources do these nocturnal artists have to keep being more and more outrageous. You know, you'd think they need money for school, or need to, what kind of jobs do they have that allows them to purchase magnesium and throw
gold.
in the field, and, solid gold plates.
You know, one other thing that we haven't touched upon, which I've heard oftentimes given as a indicator of a crop circle formation that is probably not man-made, is the notion that, and I think Colin Andrews and some other people have talked about this, that for some crop circles, people who have actually entered the field of the crop circle have experienced bizarre psychological experiences have become disoriented, have become nauseous. It's almost like there's some kind of, and I want to say electromagnetic field, but that's assuming that we know what it is. But those kind of experiences would seem to argue against Dave and Doug type of thing, that there's some residual energy there that somehow affects humans in an adverse way. Does that, in your research into crop circles, is that another factor that seems to be somewhat distinguish the fake from the non-fake? I think actually that video that I referred to earlier, the Crop Circle's Quest for Truth, has some scenes of people entering. I mean, they're anecdotal. I can't remember if they're actual scenes where people go into the crop circle and then explain on camera some kind of odd, like disorientation, vertigo effect, or they recount that as a story later on, kind of anecdotal. But it seems like that's been another factor. And it would be hard to believe that Dave or Doug, with making some kind of a board and ropes, could produce some kind of electromagnetic effect which would disorient people.
There's certainly a lot of documented cases where electrical equipment fails, specifically. And I have a personal story to relate regarding that too. But let me first, before I do that, I think it's Lucy Pringle, who's a longtime researcher, a crop circle researcher. She's got a big database of hundreds, I think at last count it was 400 or 500 cases of physical effects on people entering the formations. They typically, get dizzy, nauseous, headaches, loss of balance, euphoria sometimes too, and just there really does appear to be some residual energy of some kind, and the way we know that it's real energy and not just an imaginary effect on people is that photographic equipment frequently malfunctions. It behaves erratic. Compasses do strange things. Magnets do strange things. And we're talking from the cheapest camera on up to very, very expensive video equipment, because there have been big film crews in and around these things reporting the same thing with their super expensive equipment. So something is physically affecting people and equipment, and again, that is of course consistent with some sort of residue from a plasma event, a vortex, or whatever you want to call it, as opposed to Doug and Dave stomping grain. Clearly Doug and Dave shouldn't have any effect like that. And I guess now I can relate my story, if you like.
Yeah, do that. I think it's an interesting story.
It was 1994, September 13th, actually, I remember, because that's the birthday of one of my longtime childhood friends. And my wife and a couple other couples were on vacation in Oregon, Cannon Beach, Oregon. We had rented a house there, and we went to a place called Hug Point, and went out and just, did typical things on the beach, climbed around in caves and stuff, and ran in the waves. And after a few hours, we decided to drive back to the house, and on the way up, we had to kind of walk up a small incline to get back up to the road. And on the way to the incline, I looked over in the corner of this cove. There were concentric rings. I counted them, and you can count them in the picture. The pictures later. There were 33 rings, concentric rings. Looking like a target, basically, but with rings. I guess concentric is the best way to describe it. Down to a very small ring in the center. And I, having just gotten into, like I said, it was 93 when I really started paying attention to this stuff. Having just gotten into this subject, it of course intrigued me. Everyone else walked past and didn't notice, but I looked at them and like, what the heck is that? Somebody was messing around or whatever.
And this was in the sand, right?
It was in the beach, yes, in the sand. And this was really a rather secluded little area. I mean, there were probably half a dozen people wandering around down the beach and whatever. And there was nobody around this little corner of the cove. Just these rings right there, sort of pretty much out of place. And so I went and I said, this is bizarre. I'm gonna take pictures of it, just for fun. So I went and took pictures with my cheap little camera. My at the time, girlfriend, who later would be my wife and still is, her friend had brought a cheap camera too. They took pictures, and her other friend took video of it. So we got a lot of video. Now, my camera completely jammed, I discovered later. And when I sent the pictures in to be developed, that was, that was like 15, almost 20 years ago. And you had to actually go, it wasn't digital. You couldn't go home and print it out on your computer. You had to send it in. So I sent my pictures in, and they were delivered to me apparently by FedEx, but apparently somebody stole my pictures. So I never got to see my pictures. I lived in a little apartment there. The FedEx guy probably just put it on the doorstep and somebody took them, I guess. I mean, I guess I don't need to get more conspiratorial than that. It's weird, and it was probably the package I most looked forward to that year or longer. But luckily, my wife's friend had taken pictures also. Well, it turned out that half of her pictures were blank, just plain old black, and
these were all pictures of the concentric rings that you saw.
She didn't take pictures of nothing. She took the whole roll, so there should have been pictures, but half of them were blank. She did get a few pictures, luckily, and the video camera appeared to be unaffected. And so we did have video, which ended up on Fox's show Sightings.
I remember Sightings.
Which ran for a few years, I think. I think it was a fairly successful show. But anyway, we have those pictures. You can probably search for them. Sand rings. I know that...
Sand rings at Hug Point?
Hug Point, I know that...
Is that H-U-G?
Hug Point, yes. H-U-G. There was a researcher named Ilis. She went by one name. I haven't spoken to her for 15 years, probably. I don't know what she's doing. I-L-Y-E-S. She wrote up a neat article that's still out there in cyberspace on the whole thing. It turned out she went later and collected sand samples from, judging by the picture I gave her, she went to the center of the thing and dug up some sand samples. She actually sent them took them to W.C. Levengood, and he did an analysis of the sand grains, and he said he saw something he'd never seen before. I forget the exact numbers discovery, but basically said that there were far too many negative ions in the sample that he looked at compared to the control samples, which she took from way outside where the circle would be. So even in that case, he found something strange, and again he hypothesized that it was the energetic phenomenon had come down and that basically imprinted a few inches into the sand, if I recall correctly. Anyway, it's been a while, but there was some strange results that came out of that research.
So a couple obvious questions about your experience. The person who collected the sand samples from where you saw this formation, do you have any sense of how long it was after you had seen that these samples were taken? I'm trying to give a time frame here, how long that thing might have lasted, I guess.
Yeah, it was some time. It
wasn't like the next day or a few hours later?
It may have been weeks or months.
And it was still there.
So again, she wrote a summary in 1997. They took surface samples, and I'm reading just from my account of it here, that they took control samples, and then sand taken from 6 to 8 inches below the formation showed a high anion level of 51.1% above control level. So they dug deep and found what could be hypothesized to be an energetic imprint from whatever created the circles. So the other thing that I didn't mention that was really convinced me that this was a genuine formation was that other than the camera not working, which was just bizarre. I mean, what are the odds of that? The camera worked fine the whole time. It even worked after that. I don't think it's permanently broken. I still have it. It didn't work. It jammed. That was bizarre. The pictures didn't show up. That was strange, too. There was nothing wrong with my wife's friend's camera. Everything else was fine except for the pictures that she took in that time frame. But when I looked closely, and you can see it in the pictures on the outside of the biggest of the 33 rings, the outer circle. On the outside, there's a very small, maybe 4 to 5 diameter set of circles also, set off to the side, like tangent to the main formation. And why that, anyone who gotten into crop circles, why that is significant, they will know that that's a feature that, especially in their early formations, that the researchers would call it grape shot formation. It was just a sort of an ancillary and just an extra, almost like a signature or something, a very small set of circles set outside the main circle. And so, if that was a hoax of some kind, if somebody constructed that, they must have really known something, sort of the subtler details of the phenomenon, to put that grape shot circle out there, because that was a really fine, subtle detail that most people probably would have missed. Most people probably walked past that, didn't give it a second thought. But I looked at it, and I happened to be knowledgeable about the things, and that really struck me too. Again, you can see that in the picture.
What could have been a non-paranormal, and maybe I'm putting too much emphasis on this, what could have been a natural explanation for what happened there? What could have caused that? Besides some kind of vortex, plasma vortex that livened it. Let's say his analysis was wrong for whatever reason. What could have caused that? What do you think?
Well, that's the big question. I can't think of any. I mean, it really is. A lot of scientific questions are not so easily, narrowed down to just two hypotheses, two explanations. But the crop circle issue, you really can narrow it down, I think, to very few possibilities. And one is just physical hoaxing. Somebody took a stick, planned it out, and did 33 circles, and then they did a little grape shot set of circles just for good measure on the outside of it. That's really the only explanation I can think of that you would consider to be mundane. Now, of course, you have to take all the evidence together, and that includes the equipment malfunctions. In this case, there weren't physical effects. I didn't feel anything. Nobody else said anything. But you have to take those into account when they happen, and then the sampling of the sand in this case, but the grain in most other cases. You have to take all those things into account and get an overall picture of what it's Occam's razor, right? The simplest explanation that explains all of the evidence. You can't just leave out certain evidence because it doesn't fit into your simple explanation. And that's been the fatal flaw of the whole Doug and Dave mechanical flattening theory, is that, yes, it's simple. It's very simple, someone walking on the grain, but it doesn't take into account all of the evidence. So you can't claim that that is an Occam's razor, a simple explanation sort of answer. So to answer your question, the only thing I can think of is the Leavengood's, some sort of energetic phenomenon either coming down or coming up. There's been some speculation that underground water aquifers interacting with chalk, basically creating a magnetic field through friction, emanating waves, which I guess gets into the whole idea of ball lightning and earthquake lights and things like that. So there's a body of evidence that could support those sorts of theories too. But the intelligent aspect that you see in the designs, that's what convinces me it's something that's not just purely a natural Earth phenomenon.
Well, I'm reminded, I guess, to some degree by M. Night Shyamalan's movie Signs, and maybe just kind of this Fox Mulder's poster in the X-Files, I want to believe, maybe explain this. But the notion that these presentations in vegetable matter or in sand or whatever other medium we're talking about are really symbols, are forms of symbolic communication. And if you go if you go to that type of explanation, then the next question to ask is, well, who's communicating with us? And what do the symbols mean? And I don't think there's any obvious answer to that, but So what's your speculation about that? Given the couple of possible causes that you talked about for crop circles, what about this idea that it's a symbolic form of communication where some other intelligence, whether it be Gaia, the living Earth, or some people would go out and say it's some kind of ET phenomenon. What's your speculation about that?
Well, that's where the conversation gets fun, really. I mean, I think it's fun to look at the evidence, and again, I've got dozens of points of evidence, physical anomaly after physical anomaly. There are, cases of burn marks, like I said, the meteoritic, the metals in it, the bizarre powders that you find in the middle, bent nodes, blown nodes. I mean, there's a whole elongated nodes that there's no explanation for whatsoever. A node, basically one of the joints in the grain, expands 200, 300, 400%. That just, there's no reason that would happen naturally. And so I find all that sort of stuff fascinating. And I could spend a long time on that. We already have spent some time on that. But I just wanted to mention all of this stuff that we're talking about is online. It's at controversial-science.com. So the dash being a dash, not the word, of course. So controversialscience.com. And you can see up there is a paper that I wrote. It's a comparison of two leading crop circle formation theories, and it compares the mechanical flattening hypothesis with the plasma event hypothesis. So go there if you're interested in the real details of the evidence. So to address your question, the fun part, what or who creates these things? And I know this is kind of where your interest is. More probably than getting into the real nitty-gritty details. Because
well, I would just point out before you go there that because people may hear this podcast and they actually have some kind of encounter with or interaction with, may find a crop circle. I would just like to interject at this point in time that you could email the Olympia Paranormal organization research group. And we would actually go out and investigate a crop circle if there were some evidence out of that.
We would love to do that.
So if you find yourself listening to this podcast and you have knowledge of some crop circle, this would be in the Olympia, Washington area or one of the contiguous counties. If you would contact us at admin@olyparanormal.org, we'd be more than happy to investigate that. So before you went on with your speculation, I wanted to kind of throw in that point there because I think that's you're right. We don't necessarily want to just think about this in the abstract. If we have an opportunity to do some hands-on investigation of the phenomena, we'd want to do that as well. So I'm sorry. Go ahead and.
Well, there was, speaking of this area, there was a formation in Chehalis, which is what 20, 30 miles south of here. There was also one. Where was it? Further south. I think it was. Was it Battleground? Somewhere down there.
Down by Vancouver?
Yeah. And I went on this long odyssey to check out an interesting phenomenon in Coupeville, which is an island, I believe, up here in the Puget Sound. It was like a 2 or 3 hour trip to get there. I don't know that it was a formation. It was just a lot of really downed, big area of downed crop. When I went, I couldn't see anything specifically. I did take samples, which I regret. I later threw them away. But I think later samples were taken from there. It's probably from BLT, that group. And I think they did find some interesting results from looking at that crop. Now that brings up an interesting question, or observation too, which again tells you that you go where the evidence leads you. And that incident in Coupeville, it was, like I said, a big field of just what appeared to be randomly downed crop, barley or wheat. I think it was wheat, but it just appeared to be random, And what you discover when you look through all of these reports and things is that some of the biggest anomalies discovered in terms of the elongated nodes and the blown nodes occur in what appears to be randomly downed crop. So that sort of finding is something that will annoy both the believers and the skeptics, because the believers, for lack of a better term, and there are lots of better terms actually. I would say the researchers, the people who really followed this, and they expect, beautiful geometry, because that's what we've seen. And then the skeptics also expect a work of art, So what they see, this very haphazard, ugly spot of downed grain, and that it turns out to be as anomalous as any other formation. It's confusing, because why would crop circle guys just go in and mess up the thing, a field, randomly? Not very artistic. And at the same time, if it's these intelligent aliens who are beaming down messages to humans, why would they create such a mess? So it's very confusing. To me, though, it makes sense in the model that I subscribe to, because if you have a technology that is, I think, coming from above to imprint, basically it's like cookie cutter energy from a template of some kind coming down to weaken these stalks, they fall over, create the design. I would assume that on occasion, from whatever variances in your technology, you may have a mistake, a burst of energy that gets out of control or spills over or is misdirected or aborted or something like that. And so you get these just splashes of energy that have the same effect on the grain, but they don't come out in a pretty pattern. So I'm sure you're asking me what my theory is, who's behind this. Of course, that's a question that I wish I knew the answer to, and I suspect it's some sort of intelligence that resides with us all the time. It may be a joint effort between humans and another type of intelligence. It may be a human intelligence that's operating in a different realm, so to speak, that is manipulating the various layers of the atmosphere, the ionosphere, whatever, to send these vortexes down and create these patterns using a template or whatever. And at the same time, I could easily buy into a government experiment, because we know that some $100 billion a year goes to black projects, where basically the Congress writes a blank check, hands it over, and says, go do your stuff with it. And so we have like 16 different intelligence agencies, at least the ones that we know of. They surely could have some sort of technology piloted in a satellite or something like that to direct energy down and create these forms. Of course, you ask, why would they do that? Maybe I'll ask you that, give you a chance to speculate a little, because we're really into the realm of speculation here.
Well, and I guess I've learned as someone who's, I guess I want to characterize myself as some kind of a half-assed paranormal investigator, whatever that means.
Right. Is there any other kind?
Yeah, I don't know. I was once asked what kind of credentials you had to be a paranormal investigator, and I said just a rabid curiosity and a little bit of a loose screw, one place or another. I think that the speculation is not that speculation isn't warranted, but I think that anything that you could almost conceive of mentally, you could fit into some kind of a pattern here. Speaking of crop circles, that would fit. Mm-hmm. I think that there are a lot of things that we may not ever know the answer to. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what that's about. I mean, some people would have almost a religious or spiritual explanation for that. It's like the agnostic who says, well, I'm agnostic not because I don't think there is a God, but I think that God, whatever he, she, it, they may be, is so far beyond my comprehension that I have to admit ignorance of it. So rather than speculate, and I think some of my speculation would probably be like yours, that it could be an artificial intelligence, whether that be of the earth or not of the earth, the speculation becomes a little bit, I'm not sure what the word I want to use. Speculating doesn't seem to do any good, because
it doesn't satisfy.
Well, it's because at this point in time, you don't know the answer. You may not know the answer in 10 years. I mean, we've been talking about this crop circle phenomenon going back to the 1600s, and we've got beyond calling it a mowing devil but now we're trying to figure out who would leave a potentially prosperous amount of a substance in a crop circle. What kind of motivations would spur that? So I guess what I want to say is that this is what keeps me being a paranormal investigator, and it keeps me wanting to do shows like Anomalies with you, because we raise a lot of questions. I don't know that we particularly answer those questions, but the search for the mystery, the search for the answer, if there is an answer, and there may or not be an answer, that's what keeps me involved. It's almost like the parable would be some of those people who would say, well, what's the most important part of your life? What you do, the outcome of your life, or the fact that you've had this experience of how many years? Is it the journey more important than the destination? So for me, that's where this metaphor works. It's the journey. I may not get to the destination in terms of what the answer to crop circles or the Bigfoot phenomena is, or UFOs, or whatever paranormal topics we want to talk about, but it's just the ability to talk about these things. So once again, I really encourage anybody who's listening to this podcast that has an experience with a crop circle, that feels like they have a crop circle, some kind of formation in a crop that they're growing or they're harvesting or that they've come across, to contact us at www.adminoliparanormal.org, because we'd like to continue that process of investigation.
No,
So
but the website is OPRG.
Well, actually, the website is Oli Paranormal.
Oh, it's only, yes.
Yeah,
okay.
.org. So if you just send an email, you can send us, because it has a contact function on the website. So if you just send us an email at admin, I'm Dan Hall or one of the other investigators, and maybe even David Jinks.
I think you have a Dan Hall at
right. If they want to send us
OPRG,
a specific email to me,
you can go to the website.
You can just go to the website, because it has a contact. That's where it will be sent to. Yeah. But I really would encourage people that do have those experiences to contact us, because I enjoy just the ability to sit around and speculate and explore and learn about. I mean, just this conversation that we've had, you walk away from that knowing more than you did when you sat down for the conversation. So.
Right. I know we're getting near the end here. I just wanted to say one more thing along those lines, and that I would certainly say I enjoy the journey, but I also do want to learn some things and conclude some things. Some of these topics, it just seems like, and it may be true, that we'll never get to the end. We'll never know. I would like to put to rest some of these topics eventually. I mean, that's the ultimate goal. And at the same time, though, along the way, you can learn certain things that represent an endpoint of some kind anyway, even if you don't solve the whole mystery. And one thing that comes to mind is that I mentioned John Burke, who's unfortunately passed away. He was the physicist. He was the B in the BLT research. He, in his studies of the grain, he and Dr. Levengood, W.C. Levengood, discovered that the grain that had been affected by what they were theorizing was the plasma vortex, the plasma event, depending on when the grain, the age of the grain, when it was exposed to this energy, it would either grow abnormally quickly or abnormally slowly. Sometimes it would stunt the growth altogether.
So it was modified in some way.
Yeah, which, again, there's several points here. Again, you can go to controversial-science.com and look at this in detail. We don't have time to do that, to talk about it in detail right now, but there are lots of observations that conform to known principles of electromagnetic radiation. The way that the grain is affected, the way that the node length changes as you get further away from the point source, and sometimes it spills out beyond. There's like an overspill of this energy outside of the formation. So what Burke did was they tried to focus in on the conditions that led to the excessive growing of the grain. And he, being a physicist and a businessman, he actually started a company that was based on being able to accelerate the growth of the grain, because they had fine-tuned this process to the point where they apparently could get some acceleration of growth. Now, it doesn't take a genius to see that that would be a marketable talent to have if you can somehow have a super growth seed, and that just goes to what I was saying about researching some of these things and the frustration of not having an answer. But along the way, you do learn some things, and you potentially can use them and advance scientific knowledge. Now, I don't know the status of Burke's company or the technology. I know that they did get a patent on it, though, so it was something they took very seriously. Unfortunately, he passed away, and I'm not sure what happened, if the other members of the group are pursuing it or not, but that's an interesting bit of evidence related to this. Admittedly, it's a mundane, it's more fun talking about aliens and unknown, vortexes coming from the sky and so on, but that's a practical aspect of getting into this research and doing it. And you wouldn't have gotten even to that point if you remained a skeptic on this sort of thing. Which is why you have to have an open mind. That's where discoveries come from.
And I think that's why we have a program called Anomalies, because we look at strange things, and hopefully we do that with some degree of skepticism, but also a degree of openness to looking at a variety of possible explanations. So I guess that does it for this episode of Anomalies. I appreciate the opportunity to do this show with my friend Dave. Just a kind of an upcoming program note that might be of interest for people waiting for our next podcast. I've been in contact with a couple of folks who would describe themselves as Bigfoot experiencers, people that have had contact with the creature, some of whom some people feel as a legendary or mythological creature. Well, after talking to these people at length, I would have to say that I'm more convinced that Bigfoot, which has always been a favorite topic of mine, is not necessarily a mythological creature, but possibly a flesh and blood creature. And we're going to have those people on probably for our next podcast. So as a program note, if you're interested in the Bigfoot phenomena, I think we'll have a program for you that may answer some questions or may just create some more questions for you. So anyway, thanks for being here, Dave, and we'll wish you good night.
Thank you, Dan. I look forward to the Bigfoot guys. That'll be great.
Yes, it'd be. Okay. All right, cool.
Good night.